Okay, welcome to our Erev Shabbat Parashat class. Parashat Va'era, the terms of redemption. This is the famous four terms that I'm referring to that everyone knows about. It's the reason why, well, one of the main reasons, let's call it the main reason, that we have the Arba Kosot, the alignment of these terms to the 4 cups of wine on our Seder, Leil Seder, both our Seder nights here in exile. The famous 4 terms of V'hoseti, v'hisalti, v'cha'alti, v'lakachti. These are 4 terms that we learn about in grade school. The kids come home with pictures about these 4 terms, and they're really ingrained in some of the basic fundamental ideas, lines, quotes that we know about in our Torah. Because we are so regular to them and acquainted, we sometimes fail to see the obvious. And there are a few obvious issues that we should have when we think about and read about these terms. And before I do, let's just go over them and see in context where they are, and let's give at least a superficial translation of them. Right at the beginning of Parashat Va'era, if you're in the Chumash Perek Vav, beginning of Parashat Va'era, and Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu in a conversation that we will backtrack on in a couple of minutes in Pasuk Vav. Lachen emor b'nei Yisrael ani Adonai, tell the people I am God. V'hoseti etchem b'tachat seblot Mitzrayim. That's term number 1. And I shall remove them, let them out, take them out of the suffering of Egypt. Again, all of this for lack of better English translation in terms. V'hisalti etchem avodatam. I shall save them from their servitude. I'll redeem them with a mighty hand, with great retribution, or perhaps with awesome wonders. And then the first 3 terms are all in one pasuk. And then in pasuk Zayin, term number 4, and I will acquire them, take them from me as a nation, and I will be for them a God. So those are the 4 terms, known more succinctly in an abbreviated way as v'hoseti, v'hisalti, v'cha'alti, v'lakachti. And because of that, let's make a toast. We'll align to and have these 4 cups of wine on Seder night. Everything on mute, please. Okay. So, well, in the 2 days in Galut of Yom Tov, we have 2 Sedarim. Yes. Okay. So, obvious question number 1. In terms of this presentation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe Rabbeinu, this long, lingering description necessary? Why can't we just capsulize and get the point in a few words? And I will save them. Seems like we are stating the same in different terminologies. It seems like there is some redundancy here in the presentation. An obvious question number 2. Hashem already gave his presentation, so to speak, to Moshe Rabbeinu in last week's parasha, the famous scene of the Seneh, of the burning bush. And in that presentation, it was quite extensive. There was an exchange back and forth between him and Moshe Rabbeinu, but throughout, when cumulatively, the summation of the exchange included what HaKadosh Baruch Hu was planning on doing for Am Yisrael. It included terms regarding wonders and miracles. It included keeping promises. It included HaKadosh Baruch Hu's sense of justice. So really, anything else, at least in terms of what was just informed to us now, would have been appropriate to stick into that presentation. What is the second presentation in terms of the plans of Hashem being told to Moshe and then conveyed to the people? Why is it necessary? Why is this broken up? Okay, so in order to answer these questions, and at the end game and final goal of this class is going to be really to understand that these 4 terms are nothing less than national, international, historical, and fundamental faith statements and terminologies being used. And thus, the real symbolism and alignment in our night of redemption, our Seder night, of the 4 cups of the 4 terms. So in order to answer these questions, we have to first look at the introduction to these 4 terms and get back to the Pesukim. So this parasha opens with a little bit of rebuke of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe Rabbeinu. Don't forget, last week's parasha ended with Moshe Rabbeinu coming back to Hashem and saying, Hashem, this is not working, right? You told me to go, I went. I asked, I pleaded, I told him, I gave him the ultimatum to Paro, and not only aren't we moving forward and progressing, we are regressing. You didn't save us. Now, there's a whole discussion in terms of what Moshe Rabbeinu's issue was to Hashem, certainly not a lack of faith, and what Hashem's response was to Moshe Rabbeinu, including in the first 2 Pesukim, or 2 to 3 Pesukim in this parasha, which essentially we're told by most commentators is a rebuke to Moshe Rabbeinu. The first couple of Pesukim, Hashem says, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, Yaakov in the name of El Shaddai. I didn't let them know my name. And let's just pick it up. And then he says in Pasuk Dalet, I also upheld my biddy to them to give them the land. So let's pick it up in Pasuk He. He tells Moshe Rabbeinu, not only have I kept and am I keeping my promise to the forefathers to give them the land in which they sojourned, the strangers, but also I've heard the screams and suffering of Bnei Israel because of the oppression of Egypt and the Egyptians upon them. And I will remember, I do remember right now, my covenant. Now, what covenant, at first glance, do we believe that Hashem's referring to? Simply speaking, based on the prior pasuk, the covenant to give them the land, right? To bring them to give them and bring them to the land of Eretz Yisrael. I now remember that. It does fit very nicely into the context here. And then he says in pasuk Vav, Lachen emor lebnei Yisrael ani Adonai. Therefore, tell Bnei Israel, I am God, and then the 4 terminologies of redemption. Now, let's peel back for a moment. This covenant, the first half of the pasuk speaks of, I've heard the suffering of Am Yisrael and the oppression, I understand, and I remember my covenant. Now, if we want to be accurate about things, the covenant being referred to has to be one, seemingly, that's a reaction to suffering. I see their suffering, and I heard, and therefore I am now going, I am activating my covenant. What covenant do we know about that is triggered based on and because of the suffering and the difficulties of Am Yisrael? We know of only one, and that is the famous Berit ben Abitarim that was explained and consecrated with Abraham Abinu in Parashat Lech Lecha. And that Berit ben Abitarim explained to Abraham Abinu that Ger Yezer Achav Be'eres Lo Lahem Va'avadum Ve'anu Otam 400 Shana, that unfortunately your offspring are going to be strangers 400 years in a land not theirs. They will be oppressed and enslaved for 400 years, and with great difficulty, then I'll redeem them. And then that Berit goes on to speak about how Hashem will redeem Am Yisrael and eventually give them the land. That was spoken to Abraham Abinu over 400 years prior to this moment. That obviously is what is being triggered rather from the suffering, so to speak, realization of God. The people are suffering. I've heard and understood it. I see the oppression, and automatic trigger, va'eskordet biriti. Okay. Now, what's that connection in the next pasuk? Therefore, tell Bnei Israel, I am God. What does the fact that I'm remembering my covenant have to do with Now tell them I'm God. And now the four terminologies of I'll take them out, I'll save them, I'll redeem them, and I'll acquire them. And this really plays in to the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu came to a certain realization that's a real reality. And that is that there is somewhat of a gap in faith right now in the Jewish people. And what is clear just from the context and the text reading in the last two parashiot, that Bnei Israel has right now a fundamental lapse in what faith was passed down to them. What I mean is as follows. Their faith in a God and a creator of the world was ironclad, and there was never that chain and link was never broken at all. And that is crystal clear. However, the faith above that, and that is that there was a plan, there was a choice made by God to choose one man, Abraham, and the forefathers, and a promise to redeem and embrace and choose a nation and go through a certain process to do so. That faith began to be lost. And you saw it in the complaining, in the reaction in last week's parasha. Now, not the leaders. He came right, Moshe Rabbeinu came, Moshe Aaron came to the leaders, gave them the acts, the symbols that God instructed them to, and Vayamin Ha'am, they believed, and they knew exactly what was going on here. God's back. But the rest of the nation was having a lot of difficulty with that. And therefore, as I said, there was that lapse. And Hashem said, listen, I am now recalling the suffering has triggered after all these decades my automatic obligations, so to speak. The Bri Ben Habetrim to Abraham Abinu. But they're going to need some fortification, some support to get back into that faith. And therefore, Lachen, in more Bnei Israel, Ani Adonai. I'm back. Ani Hashem is often said as a suffix or a prefix to certain mizvot. And when that is stated throughout the Torah, you see Hachamim, the Rashi will say, Ne'eman l'shalem sachar, Ne'eman l'pareah. Ani Hashem very much implies reliability. Faithfulness of God to pledges that he makes and promises. And therefore tell them, Ani Hashem, everything that you know about, everything that you've been told, and trust me, Bri Ben HaBetarim was like first grade, preschool, Shema Yisrael to these people. Passed down from their father Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, next 2, 3, 4, 7 generations later. That was one that was ingrained in their minds from when they're little children. That God appeared to Abraham Avinu and told them that this scenario would play out, but they needed to be reminded of it. They had to somehow connect the dots. Everything now, the picture, the pieces of the picture had to come together. And because of their suffering and oppression, they lost sight of it. Lachen, tell them, Ani Hashem, I'm here, I'm faithful, and everything that you know about, let me remind you now, from your forefather Abraham, is all coming into play. That great Bri Ben HaBetarim, which is really a historical picture that it gave Abraham Abinu, is now not only going to be fulfilled and played out and carried out, but it exactly aligns, as we'll show, to these 4 terminologies of redemption. And so what I'd like to do now we set ourselves up. And so, by the way, answer to one of the answers as to why HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't present this to Moshe Rabbeinu back at the bush. The reason is that part of this presentation of the 4 terminologies of redemption that stems from the covenant of Bri Ben HaBetarim is only based on the reaction of Am Yisrael and the necessity now to guide them, to put them in their place, to open their eyes. We needed first their reaction to the events that unfolded in the last week's parasha, and then this as the response. They weren't ready for that. It wasn't appropriate to be presented to Moshe Rabbeinu at the Seneh, at the burning bush, because it was based on what? Why do you have to tell me these? Why do you have to present me these things right now at the burning bush? It wouldn't have made sense. It's only based on Am Yisrael's difficulties that they had, their theological difficulties that they had with what's going on right now, and their lapse of faith in this regard, that now the presentation was necessary. So there'll be another answer also that we'll come up with as we go on. But what I'd like to do briefly, is now go through these four terminologies of redemption. And really, there are a number of different angles completely that one can take on these four terminologies of redemption. In fact, in my tendency to create graphic organizers, and I do that often, I have a little graphic organizer which is not being distributed to the participants right now, which includes in it a chart on a number of different views and perspectives of these four terminologies by the different commentators. But I'm not going to really go through each one separately. Rather, I'll give you an overview of them and then try to synthesize them together and give you a flowing idea and conceptual sort of flow of the four terminologies as we go through them. So really, there's so much depth in this. And I'll start from what the Kli Akar shows us, is that really the terminologies used in the covenant of Bri Ben HaBetarim with Abraham Avinu, the language itself aligns beautifully with these four terminologies of redemption. Don't forget that Hashem showed Abraham Avinu, it says, a great, awesome, dark fear fell upon him. Four terms allude to the four difficult regimes and times of oppression that their children would go through, right? You had the Bavel and Paras and Yavan and Rome, right? So that was already projected to Avraham Avinu, the future oppressions of different kingdoms over his children. And that very much is an alignment, language-wise and concept-wise, to the four terms of redemption here. Kli Akar points that out. You have the Emek Davar that speaks about these four terms of redemption as the slow dissipation of suffering and release, going from the most difficulties of oppression being sort of mitigated, and then freedom from servitude, and then non-subservience, and eventually actual freedom. Stages of release of Am Yisrael's status in Egypt. You have the Netivot Shalom, a Hasidic work, speaking of release of Am Yisrael from their assimilated state, from the culture and tendencies and surroundings and the Yetzer Hara. Slowly, the four terminologies of redemption also allude to that process of being released from their culture. And finally, the incredible, profound presentation of Rabbi Hirsch that speaks of these four terminologies is not only redemptive acts of God to his chosen nation, but really to the nations of the world in all of history, whenever there will be oppression by one people to another, and the way God sees to it that other peoples will eventually be redeemed and saved. So let's go through these four Lashonot, trying to capitalize all the ideas in a very fluid type of understanding. So we start with Hoseti etchem mitahat siblot Misraim. Siblot, lisbol means to endure. Terrible hardship, terrible suffering at the hands of evil oppressors. And Am Yisrael, we can only imagine what they were going through. HaKadosh Baruch Hu informs Moshe Rabbeinu, first things first, we're gonna tie their hands and stop this nonsense. And we're gonna put an end to the ruthless, cruel treatment of not just Am Yisrael, but this also represents, and here's the mindset of Rabbi Hirsch, the historical evil perpetrated against all peoples, brutal treatment of degrading human beings, beatings and rapes, etc., etc. It's unacceptable. I, as God, proclaim that Hoseti otam mita'at siblo Misraim. I'm not going to stand for such cruelty and sadistic behavior of one people to another ever in the history of my planet Earth. But certainly right now, real time, to Am Yisrael. That's an end. Okay, wonderful. God, says Moshe Rabbeinu, that sounds great. Is there more? Yes, there is. I'll save them from the servitude. Now, that sounds a little redundant from the first term, a little bit, right? But really, what this is referring to is something that's so incredibly necessary for the fourth step. The fourth step is, I'm going to embrace you as a nation. Out of Egypt, split the sea, Matan Torah, chosen nation. Here's the doctrine of Torah for all times. You know what? If they would have come out of Egypt without God taking certain measures, there would have been no fourth step. It would have been impossible to embrace a nation and to choose them as an identified, a self-identified, self-contained people. And the reason is because they would just leave as 2 or 3 million scattered people, as anyone else does when they immigrate from one place to another. Eventually, they just mix in, they assimilate, they survive, they go their merry way, and after a few generations, they're unrecognizable. Those people don't retain a self-contained identity. Like even you see the Chinese and Oriental around the neighborhoods, they do a pretty good job in being self-contained, right? But for how long? For how long will that last? History tells us not too long. But therefore, it couldn't be that way. And God says as follows, I have to do something else besides relieving them from the terrible physical suffering. The servitude not only means the official slavery, it also means that I have to do something while they're still in Egypt to give them an identity back, a pride back, to start to let them disengage from that culture, from those tendencies, from the immoral tendencies and culture and nature around them, and start to draw a very clear line between us and them. Yes, they kept their names and they kept their faith in a God. Not enough. And therefore, God said, Hisalti etchem, I'm going to save them from the servitude. I'm going to save them from the fact that they are under the harshness of this nation and their culture and their ways and their values and their immoral society. And I'm going to give them, over the course of the next months and year, their own identity back. And so when it comes time, when they leave, they're leaving as a unit. They're leaving as a self-contained people with self-determination. Step 2. Step 3, of course, how am I going to do this? The how is nothing less than the 10 makot, the splitting of the sea, and all the supernatural miracles and wonders I will perform. That's God's introduction of himself. Hello, planet Earth, population of humanity. I am God. I'm here. That was God's way of reintroducing himself to the world. And Ga'alti represents those historic wonders that the world always turns back to and says, there's a God in this world. And that's what gave monotheism the chance to bloom. So the how of taking them out was very much an international objective. And then finally, of course, I'm now ready to embrace you. I am now, as you will be saved and then identified and then done in a grand way through which the entire world recognizes. I just have to serve you on a silver platter now and embrace you and give you the Torah, because stages 1, 2, and 3 is a setup for stage 4. So it turns out that these 4 Leshonot Geulah, these 4 terminologies of redemption, are so much more than actual practical, pragmatic saving of slaves from a nation. They're historic. They transcend time. And that's another reason, by the way, that Moshe wasn't ready for it by the burning bush, by the Sinai, because it wasn't just a matter of, all right, Moshe, here's my plan for you. This was the big picture, these 4 terminologies. The depth of them speak of Am Yisrael, of humanity, of the present, of the future, of God vis-a-vis the world. There's tremendous depth in them. There's different perspectives of them. Nothing to do with Hashem's first presentation to Moshe. This had to be an isolated presentation. And so therefore, certainly we answer that question. And as to, could it have been said in one statement? Absolutely not. Each one of these represent many things, but certainly they each are independent of each other. And the famous 4 terminologies with which we will celebrate and we do every Pesach night with our 4 cups, represents nothing less than the plans of God for his people, and also as an extension for the people on earth, and the final objective of the distant future of why we are a nation and why we went through this process in Mitzrayim. Indeed, the four Lashonot Geulah, the terminology is redemption, simply says and explains why we are who we are and how HaKadosh Baruch Hu planned to do so. Shabbat Shalom.